Black CEO denied first-class seat. 12 minutes later. He grounds the jet and removes the pilot. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the story. You don't belong here. The words detonated inside the cabin like a glass breaking against steel, sharp, cold, purposeful. The female pilot, tall, blonde hair knotted into a precise regulation bun, was standing in the narrow aisle of the private jet, her chest rising with fury beneath the crisp white uniform. 3 black stripes on her shoulder glinted under the cabin lights like warning marks on a predator. Her finger was an arrow aimed straight at the man standing before her. He didn't flinch. The black man, mid-50s, salt and pepper beard, dressed in a pale blue shirt as simple as it was immaculate, held her gaze with a calm, so steady it almost seemed unnatural in such a charged moment. His expression was not fear, not embarrassment. It was the stillness of a man who had weathered storms far louder than her voice could ever be. Behind them, 4 businessmen in tailored suits paused mid-movement, one with a champagne flute, one already recording with his phone, one leaning back with a smirk, as if enjoying a show head paid top dollar for. The last shifted uncomfortably but said nothing, silence becoming compliance. The jet hummed softly around them, the low mechanical breathing of a machine built for power, wealth, and exclusivity. Leather seats stretched out in polished rows, windows framing a sky thick with golden afternoon light. Everything about this cabin whispered privilege. Everything except the way they were looking at him. The pilot stepped closer. Her voice rose, slicing through recycled air. I said this section is restricted. First-class cabin only. Not passengers like you. The emphasis hit like a shove. A vein pulsed in her temple. Her grip tightened on the cabin wall as if steadying herself not from turbulence, but from anger sharpened by entitlement. The businessmen behind her murmured. One let out a short laugh, the kind meant to wound without appearing involved. The man finally spoke. "Mom," he said, voice low, steady. "This is my assigned seat." "Impossible," she snapped back. "You're not on the manifest. I checked it twice. Step back to economy before I have security drag you there." Economy. On a private jet. Someone in the back snorted, delighted by the absurdity. The camera phone rose higher. The space shrank tighter. Even the hum of the engine seemed to quiet, as though the jet itself was listening. He straightened his collar, the slow, deliberate movement of someone refusing to let the air around him define his place within it. "I boarded like everyone else," he replied, "with a boarding pass. With a name." "And I said," she cut in, voice trembling with a self-righteous fire, "this cabin is reserved for owners, executives, and investors, not freeloaders trying to sneak into spaces they don't qualify for." A whisper rippled through the back row's agreement disguised as surprise. The man with the champagne leaned forward, whispering to his friend. Knew something was off when he got on. The friend nodded, adding, "Happens all the time. They think no one will notice. No one corrected them." The air thickened, pressing against the walls of the cabin. The pilot took another step, invading his space, her finger now only inches from his chest. "Move," she commanded. "I'm not repeating myself again." He looked at the finger, then at her, then at the silent crowd behind her, their eyes bright with the dark thrill of watching humiliation packaged as procedure. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Marcus. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered barely, but enough for the tension to feel electric. His breathing stayed slow, controlled, dangerous in its restraint. He shifted his weight just slightly, and for a heartbeat, something changed in the air. Not loud, not visible, but unmistakable. A temperature drop, a silence pulling tight like a drawn bowstring. The kind of quiet that comes not before chaos, but before consequence. The pilot didn't feel it, the businessmen didn't sense it, but the plane did. And it knew just as the sky outside knew that she had picked the wrong man to challenge, on the wrong day, in the worst possible way. Because in 12 minutes, everything inside this cabin would turn upside down. And the woman pointing her finger would realize she hadn't just insulted a passenger. She had provoked the owner. For a breathless moment, the entire cabin froze. Not literally, but in that strange, heavy way a room sometimes does when humiliation becomes a spectacle. The air seemed to crystallize around the pilot's outstretched finger, trapping the tension in a cold, suspended frame. The private jet, normally a sanctuary of polished gold trim, warm lighting, and quiet luxury, suddenly felt like a courtroom balanced on a knife's edge. The fluorescent strips along the ceiling buzzed faintly. The hum of the engines flattened into a low, uneasy drone. And the bodies inside the cabin became statues carved out of privilege and discomfort. A man in the front row shifted first, tall, mid-40s, navy suit. His eyes flicked between the pilot and the black man standing in the aisle. He didn't speak. He didn't intervene. He simply crossed his arms, as if settling in to watch the continuation of a show he had not paid for but was now fully invested in. 2 seats behind him, another passenger young, hair slicked back, shoes polished to a mirror shine, slowly lowered his champagne flute. His mouth curled into a soft half-smile, the kind people wear when cruelty entertains them, the kind that has no guilt attached. Beside him, the man with the phone kept recording, angling his camera for a clearer shot. The reflection of the cabin lights shimmered across his screen, framing the pilot's fury and the CEO's stillness like the opening act of a viral clip waiting to explode online. It was as if the plane itself understood what was happening. The leather seats, deep brown and immaculately conditioned, seemed to shrink inward. The tinted windows reflected each face back at itself, some smug, some uncertain, some quietly horrified but too cowardly to intervene. Even the brass details along the cabin wall glinted with a harsher shine, catching the tension like polished witnesses. The pilot's voice echoed in that suspended silence, still vibrating from the last harsh command shed thrown at him. But for the first time, she hesitated. A flicker, small, fleeting, passed through her eyes. Not doubt, not guilt, just the faint awareness that something about the way he stood, the stillness carved into his posture, didn't match the narrative shed built around him. He wasn't intimidated. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't even offended. He was simply waiting. Waiting with a composure that didn't belong to an intruder. Waiting with a calm that didn't belong to a man out of place. Waiting with the poise of someone who had already decided how this moment would end long before she raised her voice. The businessmen didn't see it. They saw only what they expected to see. A man they believed didn't fit the room. But the cabin felt it. The lights dimmed ever so slightly. The air pressure shifted. The hum of the engines deepened, like a heartbeat preparing for the next beat. And in that breathless, cinematic stillness, one truth became clear even if no one realized it yet. This wasn't a scene about a pilot enforcing rules. This was a moment about power. Who thought they had it? Who truly owned it? And who was seconds away from having their illusions shattered at 30,000 feet. The freeze frame held a moment longer, then cracked, preparing for the fallout. Something subtle changed, so subtle that no one could name it. But every set of lungs in the cabin felt it. A dip in temperature, a tightening of silence. A drop in the cabin's invisible pressure, as if the air itself had leaned in to listen. The pilot sensed it first. Her jaw clenched. Her shoulders stiffened beneath the crisp white uniform. For the first time since Shed raised her voice, she took a half-step back so small it barely registered, so instinctive she didn't realize Shed done it. The man she was confronting, still motionless, still impossibly calm, lifted his eyes toward her with the quiet precision of someone examining a problem he had already solved. Not anger, not fear, not even annoyance, just clarity. The clarity of a storm about to choose where to strike. Behind her, one of the businessmen shifted in his seat. The smug smile he had worn so comfortably slipped a fraction. Something about the CEO's stare steady, unbroken, pressed against him like a weight he didn't expect to feel. He whispered, "Why isn't he reacting?" His friend answered, "Because he knows he's wrong. That's why." But the words rang hollow the moment they left his mouth. Across the cabin, the light flickered. Just once. Just long enough for the pilot's eyes to dart upward before snapping back down to him, irritation flaring to cover the brief spark of unease. "Don't look at me like that," she said sharply. "You're not intimidating anyone." Yet her voice, once sharp as metal, carried a faint tremor now, a thin crack running under the surface. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. His silence felt deliberate, engineered. A silence that didn't back down, it demanded acknowledgement. The man with the phone recording adjusted his angle again, his breath shallow. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a quiet instinct whispered the truth. Something about this was slipping out of the pilot's control. Something was off script. "Hello, I'm delighted to assist you with our voice services. Choose a voice that resonates with you, and let's begin our creative audio journey together." And then there was that moment, simple, quiet, devastating, when he adjusted his sleeve. Just his sleeve. A tiny gesture, a micro-movement. But the effect was seismic. Something about that controlled motion, that total composure, that razor-thin restraint sent a chill down the cabin, a thrill of recognition, though no one could name what exactly they were recognizing. It was the body language of someone who had nothing to fear. The posture of someone accustomed to command, the calm of someone who never needed to raise his voice, to dominate a room. For the first time, the pilot hesitated before speaking. Don't try to intimidate me," she said again, this time quieter, the conviction leaking out of the edges. But the imbalance had already shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't something the passengers could point at. It was in the stillness, in the weight of his gaze, in the way the cabin air responded to him, not her, in the way the jet hummed like it recognized its real master. And for the briefest flicker, as her breath caught and her heart misfired a single panicked beat, the pilot understood exactly what the room had not yet realized. She had not been speaking down to a nobody. She had been provoking someone who could end her entire flight with a sentence. The shift was complete. The fall hadn't begun yet, but the balance of power had already changed hands. Long before the pilot raised her voice, long before the passengers leaned in like spectators circling a wounded animal, long before this cabin became a small stage, trembling under the weight of ego, this man had already lived. Through storms, far darker than prejudice, at 30,000 feet. His name was Marcus Ellison Grant, 53 years old, black, unbothered, and infuriatingly calm in moments that would break lesser men. To the cabin, he looked like a quiet professional who'd wandered into the wrong section, a misplaced passenger, an inconvenience to be corrected, a body they thought they could push away with rules that never actually existed. But the truth compressed, buried under layers of privacy, was far heavier. "Hello, I'm delighted to assist you with our voice services. Choose a voice that resonates with you, and let's begin our creative audio journey together. Power without spectacle, influence without noise, a ghost in a world obsessed with visibility. But that ghost had a history, one that shaped the stillness he carried now. At 21, Marcus had been denied a business-class seat on a regional flight because people like you don't pay for seats like this. At 27, a private banker had asked if he actually belonged in his own appointment. At 30, he was escorted out of a shareholder's lounge after being mistaken for staff, twice. These weren't traumas he revisited. They were lessons, blueprints. Every insult became a silent ledger entry fuel that he burned into a multi-billion-dollar empire. By 40, Marcus had built Aeronox from a garage operation powered by stubborn genius into a titan that dictated standards for the aviation industry. By 50, he had become the kind of man executives feared meeting in negotiations because he negotiated like a surgeon cuts, steady, precise, irreversible. And now, at 53, he stood in this cabin with nothing more than a boarding pass and a calm expression, but the truth was far more electric. Half the systems keeping this plane operational belonged to him, and the authority to ground every aircraft in the Stellaris fleet with a single directive rested somewhere inside the phone in his pocket. He hadn't taken this flight to test his power. He had taken it to test their service quietly, anonymously, without titles or introductions. He wanted to understand how passengers were treated before his acquisition changed anything. He preferred to see the raw truth of people, not the polished version offered to CEOs, and the raw truth was ugly. Now, as the pilot glared at him like he was a trespasser in a world built for others, the passengers around them assumed his silence came from fear. It didn't. His silence came from restraint. Because Marcus knew something none of them did. This flight was about to become the most expensive mistake this company had ever made. He didn't need to announce his status. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to flash credentials or bark orders. All he needed to do was decide, a decision he was moments away from making. And when he finally acted, the pilot would understand too late that she had never been speaking to a man who didn't belong. She had been speaking to the man who owned the skies she was flying through. The tension inside the cabin had reached a fragile, electric stillness thin as glass, ready to fracture at the slightest pressure. And that pressure arrived in the form of one final shove. The pilot stepped forward, invading Marcus' space with a confidence built not on authority, but on assumption. Her hand, rigid and trembling with indignation, pressed against his shoulder, not a violent push, but a dismissive one meant to remind him of his supposed place. "Move!" she snapped. Last warning. A collective inhale rippled through the passengers. The man with the champagne froze mid-sip. The phone recording tilted upward, its lens widening as if sensing history sharpening its edges. Marcus' body barely moved under her touch. He simply absorbed it, absorbed the insult, the arrogance, the entitlement, and let it settle in the air like the final drop of fuel before ignition. He looked down at her hand, then up into her eyes, and something in the cabin shifted again. Not in the temperature this time, not in the lighting, but in the balance, like the world had just slid an inch to the side. Marcus inhaled once, quietly, deeply. Then he reached into his pocket, not fast, not dramatic, but with the deliberate precision of a man retrieving a key that opens more than doors. His phone unlocked to a screen of encrypted controls. Layers of silent authority, a language of power only a handful of people in the aviation industry could read. His thumb hovered for a moment, long enough for the pilot's brows to knit in confusion, long enough for the men behind her to lean forward, long enough for the cabin to tighten around the moment like a throat holding its breath. Then, with surgical calm, he tapped a command. A single, quiet chime followed. That was it. No flourish, no announcement, no grand reveal, but the effect was immediate. The jet's engines hummed lower, as if grudgingly obeying a command issued from somewhere above their rank. The cabin lights flickered once soft, controlled, unmistakable. Then the overhead speakers crackled, breaking the silence with a clipped, unexpected message. "Attention crew, stand by. Ground control requesting immediate operational pause." Returning to gate, the pilot's eyes widened. "What? That makes no sense." "We're cleared for." Her headset crackled again. "Captain, hold position." "Repeat, hold position." Authority override received. She froze, completely, as if someone had snapped her spine straight with a single command. "What override?" she demanded into her radio. "From who?" "Static." Then, from senior operations. "Ma'am, directive states, do not proceed. Await personnel boarding." The passengers shifted uneasily. The man recording lowered his phone a fraction, suddenly unsure if he was still documenting humiliation or something far larger. Marcus didn't speak. He didn't smile. He simply placed his phone back into his pocket and adjusted his sleeve with the same quiet dignity Head held from the moment she first raised her voice. The pilot stepped back, color draining from her face. "You, what did you just do?" Her voice shook for the first time. Marcus finally looked at her fully, eyes steady, unreadable, carved in a kind of power that didn't announce itself, it was simply felt. His reply was soft. A whisper of thunder before the storm. "I made a decision." Behind her, one of the businessmen muttered, This doesn't feel right." Another whispered, "Who is he?" The pilot swallowed hard, trying to piece together the fragments of control slipping through her fingers. But the plane had already answered the question she hadn't asked. This was no passenger she could command, no man she could bark orders at, no outsider she could push aside to maintain the illusion of her authority. This was someone whose influence reached beyond her uniform, beyond this cabin, beyond the sky they were sitting in. And as the engines fully powered down and the jet taxied toward the gate under orders she did not issue, the truth finally began to dawn on her. She had not delivered the last warning. He had. And she had just triggered a consequence she could never take back. The jet shuddered gently as it rolled back toward the gate, guided not by the pilot's authority, but by a chain of commands now moving far above her pay grade. Every passenger felt the shift, not turbulence, not weather, but power changing hands. The pilot stood frozen in the aisle, headset clutched in her shaking fingers. She stared at the cockpit door as though it might open and explain what was happening. It didn't. Instead, a sharp knock echoed from the front entryway. The cabin door hissed open. Two men in dark navy uniforms, not flight staff, not gate agents, stepped inside. Their badges gleamed under the cabin's dim lights, embossed with a seal few passengers would ever see up close, unless something had gone terribly wrong. Stellaris Charter Operations Enforcement Division. The room inhaled collectively. The lead officer scanned the cabin with the calm detachment of someone accustomed to stepping into chaos and restoring order, brick by brick. His eyes landed on Marcus first, only for a second, but long enough to acknowledge something unspoken. Then he turned to the pilot. "Captain Rowan," he said, voice smooth, official, disturbingly neutral. "You are to step aside from command immediately." All color drained from her face. "This has to be a mistake," she stammered. "We were preparing for departure. There was an issue with a passenger who, Mom," the officer cut in. "Please refrain from speaking until we finish the directive." The passengers shifted restlessly, exchanging glances thick with confusion and sudden fear. The second officer opened a sleek black folder. Inside was a printed document bearing signatures and security markings. Effective immediately, he read aloud, "Captain Rowan is relieved from duty pending investigation for violation of passenger protocol, conduct unbecoming of command crew, and misuse of authority during pre-flight operations." Her lips parted. No sound came out. "This is absurd," she finally managed. "Someone manipulated the system. I need to speak to my superiors. I need." The first officer handed her a sealed envelope. "Your superiors issued this." She ripped it open with frantic fingers. Whatever she saw inside made her breath stop mid-chest. This is an operations override. The highest level. But how? Why? The officers didn't respond. They didn't need to. Behind her, the businessmen sat petrified. One whispered, "I didn't know this airline even had an enforcement division." Another replied, "It doesn't unless something catastrophic happened." The pilot glanced around desperately, looking for someone, anyone, to validate her authority. No one moved. No one met her eyes. Except Marcus. He remained standing exactly where Shed tried to force him away from minutes earlier. Calm, balanced, posture steady as marble. His silence weighed more than any accusation she could have imagined. Captain Rowan pointed at him with a trembling hand. He started this. I told him to move because he wasn't allowed in first class. He wasn't on my manifest. He isn't." The second officer looked at Marcus, then back at her. "Mom, the passenger you just pointed to is verified as the authorized occupant of seat 1A. She blinked. Hard. "That's impossible." "I checked his name wasn't," the officer continued, unbothered. "And your manifest was updated 27 minutes before boarding. The updated version was sent to your tablet and cockpit display. You failed to acknowledge it." I didn't see any." "Because," he said, his tone tightening slightly, "you never opened the update file." Silence struck the cabin like a dropped weight. Passengers exchanged horrified glances. The man recording slowly lowered his phone, realizing he had captured far more than drama. He had captured a downfall. The first officer stepped aside, gesturing toward the cockpit. "Captain, hand over your credentials." Her fingers shook as she removed her badge, her digital key card, her flight band. The officer slipped them into an evidence casing with the kind of practiced precision that suggested this was far from his first takedown. Then came the final blow. "Captain Rowan, gather your personal items. You will be escorted off the aircraft." A strangled breath escaped her. "You can't. You don't understand who I am." The officer's expression didn't change. "And you don't understand who you were speaking to." Her eyes flicked toward Marcus, fear blooming late, but blooming nonetheless. This was no routine reprimand. This was surgical retribution. Clean, quiet, absolute, and it had only just begun. With Captain Rowan standing speechless in the aisle, stripped of command and dignity one piece at a time, the cabin felt altered like gravity had quietly tilted toward Marcus. The officers stepped aside, forming a subtle corridor of deference. Not for her, for him. Passengers noticed. Their eyes darted between the grim officials, the trembling pilot, and the man who had spoken no louder than a whisper yet seemed to be orchestrating the entire collapse. The man with the phone lowered his device completely now. I think we messed up," he muttered, face pale under the cabin lights. Slowly, unhurriedly, Marcus reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. The motion was elegant, deliberate, the kind of gesture only men accustomed to control could make. A rustle of fabric, then the soft click of a leather card holder opening. He withdrew a matte black identification card, not a boarding pass, not a corporate ID, not something meant for average passengers or even average executives. The officers straightened instinctively. The pilot froze mid-breath. Marcus turned the card over in his hand once, letting the light catch the embossed seal before finally raising it where everyone could see. Aeronautics Systems founding executive authority owners, credential level Omega, the highest clearance in the aviation consortium. A credential granted to exactly 3 people in the country, 2 of whom sat on boards, and 1 of whom stood calmly in front of a pilot who had mistaken him for a trespasser. Gasps broke across the cabin like glass under pressure. The businessman with the slick hair whispered, "No, no way. Aeronautics? That's the company that his friend finished for him," voice cracking, "controls Stellaris' entire system. The jet we're on, the fleet, the company." The pilot staggered back a half step. Her voice came out in fragments. You can't be. That's impossible. I didn't know. I wasn't informed." Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You weren't informed," he said softly, "because this assessment was designed to be unannounced." The officers exchanged subtle glances confirmation. "This flight," Marcus continued, "was part of a routine anonymity check. I wanted to see how passengers were treated when there were no titles, no red carpets, no company memos." The words knifed through the cabin not violently but surgically. "Treatment that reveals truth," he added, each syllable weighted with deliberate calm, not performance. Every man watching seemed to shrink inside his suit. The phone in the recording passenger's hand trembled. Captain Rowan felt the room closing around her. I didn't know who you were," she whispered, voice collapsing inward. If someone had told me, Marcus' gaze hardened just enough to quiet her completely. "Respect," he said, "is not conditional on recognition." Silence, heavy, humiliating, absolute. "You believed I didn't belong here," he continued, "but the truth is far simpler." He stepped past her, not roughly, not victoriously, just with a quiet inevitability that erased every doubt about where authority truly resided. "I don't need permission to sit in this seat." He paused, turned slightly, met her eyes fully. "I designed the system that put this seat here." Her knees nearly buckled. The passengers held their breath. The officers didn't move. Marcus slid the Omega credential back into his jacket with the same care he had used when revealing it. "For the record," he added, voice cold as the cabin's recycled air, "your manifest error wasn't the problem." The pilot swallowed, terrified. "Then what was?" Marcus' jaw tightened. "The way you spoke to me," he said, "was the problem." And the cabin felt down to each trembling window seemed the weight of a truth long overdue. This was never a passenger challenging a pilot. This was a man reclaiming a sky he already owned. The unraveling was complete, and consequences, sharp and precise, were only beginning their descent. Chaos didn't erupt in the cabin. It seeped, slow, silent, inevitable. The moment Marcus returned the Omega credential to his jacket, the passengers who had smirked minutes earlier suddenly found their breathing shallow. Their eyes dropped to their laps, their suits felt tighter, their confidence curdled into dread. Phones vibrated first, one, then another, then a cascade, press alerts, aviation updates, emergency system bulletins. The first man who'd been recording glanced at his screen and his face went bone white. "Oh my God, it's everywhere already." The others leaned in, and the headlines stared back like judgment carved in bold. Private jet pilot removed mid-flight after protocol violation source. Aeronautics exec on board. Anonymous passenger triggers fleet override investigation unfolding. Stellaris charter under scrutiny after command level breach. Someone whispered, "This is going to destroy her career." Another muttered, "No, this is going to shake the entire company." Outside the windows, ground crew surrounded the jet, not hurried, not panicked, just coordinated, purposeful. The kind of response reserved for operations involving high-clearance individuals, not routine flights. The officers remained stationed at the front, posture rigid, awaiting further directives from above. No one questioned who above meant anymore. Captain Rowan sat in the jump seat, pale and silent, hands clenched so tight her knuckles blanched. The humiliation she tried to inflict had been reflected back at her tenfold, sharper and cleaner than any rebuke she had imagined. The businessmen who once watched Marcus like an unwelcome intruder now avoided his gaze entirely. Respect arrived late, dragged in by fear, but it arrived nonetheless. Notifications continued pinging across the cabin. Number aeronautics owner, number pilot removed, number respect in the skies, number who is Marcus Grant. In less than 20 minutes, the world outside the aircraft had begun assembling the truth. The cabin had learned too late. This wasn't just an incident. It was a story, a rupture, a shift in how power moved through the air. And the aftershock had only begun its climb through the digital sky. The descent toward real consequence, public, corporate, irreversible, was next. The cabin door opened again, this time not with urgency, but with a composed, almost ceremonial calm. The officers stepped aside. Ground crew waited with measured professionalism, and Marcus moved toward the exit, each step steady, precise, carved from a lifetime of learning where he belonged and where others believed he didn't. He paused at the threshold of the jet. The late afternoon light spilled across the tarmac, warm gold on cold metal. The engines were silent now, the aircraft grounded in more ways than one. Behind him, the passengers watched through widened, uneasy eyes. Minutes ago, they had been spectators to humiliation. Now they were witnesses to consequence. Marcus turned, not to them, but to the captain seated rigidly in the jump seat. Captain Rowan lifted her eyes only when she felt his presence. Her bravado had evaporated. All that remained was a woman who had mistaken entitlement for authority and discovered too late that the sky had rules she never learned. He didn't speak with anger. He didn't speak with triumph. He spoke with the clarity of a man who valued dignity the way others valued rank. "Command isn't a uniform," he said softly. "It's character. And today, you forgot that." Her throat tightened. She tried to respond, but the words collapsed in her chest. Marcus glanced at the passengers. Most avoided his gaze, the shame settling over them heavier than turbulence ever could. A few met his eyes briefly, silently acknowledging the truth. They had seen the worst version of their assumptions, and he had seen the best version of his restraint. He stepped down the stairs and onto the tarmac. A Stellaris representative in a charcoal gray suit approached him immediately, tablet in hand, voice trembling with practiced respect. "Mr. Grant, sir, our board has been notified. We're initiating a full compliance overhaul, effective immediately. Crew training, protocol rewrites, anti-bias audits, everything." Marcus nodded once. "Good. Is there anything else you'd like to implement personally?" He looked back at the jet, its fuselage gleaming under the sun, engines quiet, cabin still heavy with the echo of what had unfolded. "Treat every passenger," he said, "as if their dignity is the most valuable cargo on board." The representative swallowed, then bowed his head. "Yes, sir." As Marcus walked across the runway, the breeze tugged at his shirt, carrying with it the faint scent of jet fuel and warm asphalt. For a long moment, he simply stood there alone, steady, grounded in a way no aircraft ever could be. He didn't need applause. He didn't need vindication. He didn't need them to know his name. His power wasn't in the reveal, it was in the restraint before it. And as the sun dipped lower across the horizon, painting the sky in amber and fire, Marcus allowed himself a single, quiet thought, a truth forged over decades and proven once again today. Real power isn't loud. It's the kind that corrects what's broken. without ever raising its voice. The jet remained behind him, silent, humbled, awaiting a different kind of future. A future shaped by a man who refused to be small.